Welcome to C2C Journal. Today we have C2C author and Canadian writer Patrick Keeney here to talk to us about his latest C2C article, Restoring Canada, National Sovereignty in the Age of Mass Migration. In the piece, Patrick explores how Canada's current mass migration policy, 1.25 million newcomers in 2023, and 98% of population growth driven by immigration, reflects an elite ideology that treats migration as an unquestionable virtue. He contrasts this with a more traditional view of the nation as a shared home with obligations to its own citizens. Without reclaiming democratic control, he argues Canada risks weakening its social fabric and national sovereignty. Patrick, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, let's get into it. So, what made you tackle this topic now, and why do you think the debate over immigration and national sovereignty is so urgent for Canadians today?
Well, what drew me to the debate in the first place is that simply it didn't seem that we as a country were having the debate at all. And we are experiencing a significant demographic transformation. I think it is fair to say the largest and fastest in our history. And this is occurring without any ongoing public debate and with almost no political opposition. And this alone raised alarm bells in my mind. And so, for me, at its heart, the debate over immigration concerns far more than policing national boundaries or the sheer numbers. Uh, to me, immigration poses deeply philosophical questions about the nature of belonging, the nature of authority, the nature of the nation state, the common good. And yet, these questions, it seems to me, have all but vanished from our public discourse.
Mhm.
There's a technocratic, managerialist mindset, a kind of jargon, and this has insulated our debate about immigration with slogans like diversity is our strength, we are a nation of immigrants. But it seems to me that these slogans are not about enlightening the debate, but they're meant to actually stop the debate in its track. And they are rhetorical shields, if you will, that are designed to end the conversation rather than foster it.
Absolutely. And so, more on that, you call Canada's immigration policy a radical demographic experiment. Can you talk to us a little bit more in terms of what that means?
Well, it seems to me I use that phrase because this is precisely what it is. It's an experiment in the literal sense of that term. I can't think of any other liberal democracy that's pursuing immigration on the scale that we in Canada are, at the speed, and again, with so little public debate about the long-term consequences of our policies.
Mm-hmm.
It's radical. The word radical comes from the Latin root radix, and it just means the root cause of something. And to me, what's at stake ultimately is the roots of Canadian identity. And it seems, again, that the idea that we can endlessly import, millions of people and expect some kind of seamless cultural integration while simultaneously denigrating our own traditions strikes me as frankly magical thinking.
Yeah, I
And then, we have politicians who tell us that Canada is the first post-national state, whatever that might mean. Or
mhm.
they tell us that there's no such thing as Canadian and that, Canadian values are as imaginary as the unicorn and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And it always strikes me as a very peculiar thing to say about any nation, let alone our nation, which has, in my estimation, a very proud history or proud tradition. I worked with a professor at a Canadian university, and this individual was a recent immigrant from South America. And I was told in no uncertain terms that Canada had no history, that it was a blank slate upon which anybody could write what they would. Um, I don't think that's right, by the way. But my sympathies went out to the students that this individual taught,
Mhm.
young Canadians who presumably were picking up on this idea that Canada has no history, we're a post-national state, etc. And I guess I couldn't blame this individual because we have, as I say, politicians who are fond of telling us such things in so many words.
Absolutely. I think proud to be Canadian, terminology is withering away with these new slogans that are becoming more and more prevalent.
Yeah.
So, why do you think Ottawa has such high targets for immigration and temporary residents? Like, what are they trying to do, and what is the point of all this immigration?
Well, I think there are perhaps two overriding considerations. One is the economics of it. It can't be doubted that more people will grow the gross domestic product. And I think at root, though, there's a much more powerful set of ideas, an ideology, if you will.
Mhm.
And it's this cosmopolitan globalist vision
Yeah.
that we see not only in Canada, of course, we see it throughout the West. And it sees national borders as some kind of inconvenience, the nation state as perhaps some kind of retrograde relic from a less enlightened time. And to oppose this vision, of course, one is immediately labeled as xenophobic, reactionary, or in some other way morally deficient. And these accusations shut down debate instead of fostering it. And so our political class, by categorizing all dissent as bigotry,
Mhm.
evades the need to justify policies that many citizens find disruptive, disorienting, imposed from above, and not at all to their liking. And so, not everyone shares this globalist vision, it should be said. The British writer David Goodhart introduces in his work this distinction between the anywhere class and the somewhere people. The anywhere class are the educated, credentialed people who seem to be as much at home in Toronto, in Ottawa, as they are in London or Berlin or Paris or in any of the world's capitals. And so they are part of this. I don't know what you want to call it, some kind of globalist elite. And by contrast, Goodhart refers to the somewhere people. And these are people who are rooted in the memory of locality. They're formed by family, by neighborhood, the necessary boundaries of belonging. So for the somewheres, citizenship is not a transactional identity, but a moral inheritance. It's marked by memory, by sacrifice, by obligation, and the love of home. So
Mhm.
again, in my view, I think we have a widespread view that often privileges the anywhere worldview, if you will, that dismisses the attachments of the somewhere people as parochial or regressive or some such thing. And so, in doing so, it alienates the very citizens whose fidelity to place forms the backbone of any nation.
Hmm. Absolutely. So you did cover some of the consequences of this, mass migration
Mhm.
policy that Canada has inherited. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the other consequences that Canada is facing with this mass immigration? So in terms of housing, rent, healthcare, and city infrastructure?
Well, I think the consequences are visible to all of us. And let's start with housing. Canada's housing market is, I think, utterly overwhelmed. Between 2016 and 23, the country's population grew by 3 million, and housing starts just did not keep up. In Toronto and Vancouver, the average home, the detached home, is over $1.1 million in 2024. Rents rose by 20% between 2022 and 2024.
Mhm.
And so it is a crisis. I don't think that's overheated rhetoric at all. And so Canadians, for young Canadians, and increasingly even for middle class Canadians, the dream of owning their own home is no longer merely deferred, but slipping out of reach entirely. One of the consequences, of course, is the question has to arise: how is it that the people who make a city function, the teachers, the nurses, the police, those people who occupy the middle classes, the plumbers, how do they afford to live in the cities in which we need their services? And yeah, I mean, quite some time ago, we had trouble recruiting professors in Vancouver.
Mhm.
And the reason was obvious. These young PhDs would come out, eager, of course, to get their first academic appointment. And then they'd look at the cost of real estate in Vancouver and say, no, thank you very much. I can't afford to live here on what you're willing to pay me.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, I think we could scale that up or down as you want to look at it to, every kind of job, every kind of category.
Mhm.
Healthcare is under strain as well. I mean, I think all of us know stories of, the 12-hour waits in emergency wards, or
Absolutely.
emergency rooms. But even more, mundanely, I think only 1 in 6 Canadians has their own family physician. So about 6.5 million of us are without a family physician.
Mhm.
At day's end, I think, it just comes down to the idea that Canada's infrastructure simply wasn't built to absorb population increases of 500,000 people annually.
Mhm.
Yet from 2021 to 23 alone, our population grew by 1.8 million. And of course, the pressure extends beyond housing and beyond our hospitals, our healthcare. Our public schools are bursting at the seams. Transit systems are congested. Our roads are congested. Our core services, such as water and sewage, are nearing their breaking points. And again, very simply, none of our infrastructure was designed to deal with such rapid population increase.
Absolutely right. And on top of that, there's not enough employment for all these people coming in as well, right? And so
Right, right.
the housing, costs are rising, rent is rising, and people simply can't find a job sometimes, right?
Right. And what jobs are available tend to be very low paid service jobs,
Mhm.
hardly sufficient money for a living wage,
Absolutely. Yeah. So you also point out that the GDP growth often hides, falling GDP per capita. Why do you think that, matters to ordinary Canadians in your opinion?
Well, politicians are fond of saying the economy is growing, the economy is growing. And of course, the way one can grow the economy without putting much thought into it is simply import mass numbers of people. And indeed, the gross domestic product will grow, but a much more meaningful measure of economic health is GDP per capita. And that measures the economic output per person and gives a much clearer picture, I think, of individual prosperity.
Mhm.
So while our gross domestic product in Canada has grown, the GDP per capita, again, a much more meaningful measure, has stagnated or declined
Mhm.
significantly. Stats Canada tells us between 2019 and 24, Canada's GDP per capita grew by 0.2%, the slowest growth amongst developed nations. And so, while the country may look like it's prospering and booming on paper, the average Canadian is falling behind, facing higher living costs, stagnant wages, and declining access to public services. I mean, 10 years ago, I think Canadians could rightfully boast about having I hate the cliche, but a world-class healthcare system.
Mhm.
That's no longer the case. And I think again, these kind of declines are something Canadians experience on almost a daily basis.
Mhm.
Um, so we see the benefits of immigration-fueled economic growth are deceptive. And what benefits there are, what economic benefits tend to accrue to the managerial class, to the investors, to the landlords, some politicians, of course, and ordinary citizens are told we need to tighten our belts and not ask too many uncomfortable questions.
All right. So essentially, mass migration, by the sounds of it, is doing more harm than good to Canada, right? From housing costs to
Mhm.
overflowing healthcare facilities.
Mhm.
Yet political elites treat immigration as a moral cause, right?
Yeah.
So why, is it so much about this moral cause rather than what it's actually doing for Canada? And why does it make it so difficult to have an open debate around this topic?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think, I mean, I'm not sure this is going to answer it, but when you moralize a policy, whether it's immigration or anything else. Disagreement is no longer viewed as a matter of reasoned dissent. It's rather seen as a form of heresy. So you risk by questioning immigration, some kind of denunciation,
Mhm.
vilification. We all know the epithets that get hurled. You're a racist, a xenophobe.
Yep.
Uh, um, what's the other one? You're a populist. Yeah, you're a
Oh.
populist. And so opposition is no longer considered part of a legitimate democratic debate. It's viewed as a moral failing. And I think, if we step aside from the immigration debate for a moment, this seems to be a hallmark of our political moment. The replacement of political reasoning with some species of moral absolutism. But we all know, I think, that real politics involves trade-offs with compromises, prudential judgment. So when you frame the immigration debate purely in ethical, moral terms, you remove it from the realm of democratic deliberation. You make it immune to evidence, you make it immune to reasoned objection. You are, as I say, in some kind of moral absolutist way. So I think with immigration, we're seeing, to coin a phrase, a crisis of discourse, if you will,
Mhm.
a kind of moral claustrophobia where citizens are afraid to speak openly about what they see happening all around them on a daily basis. And that's a dangerous thing, not just for any particular policy about immigration, but I think for democracy itself. When citizens self-censor out of fear of being vilified, that's not a healthy place for a democracy to be.
Oh, absolutely, right. So, in terms of this idea of love for a home, okophilia, you talk about this concept.
Mhm.
How does the idea of love of home help us think differently about immigration and national unity?
Well, I borrowed that term from the late British philosopher Sir Roger Scruton, and he coined it largely in opposition to this globalist universalism that he saw as detrimental to the
Mhm.
local. Okeophilia just means love of the home. So we place virtue in the small, the local, the private, the inherited, the history of our place. It's what ties us to our traditions. It ties us to our language, our rituals.
Mhm.
Uh, John Van Hiking at the University of Lethbridge wrote a fascinating piece about the ritual of the Calgary Stampede
Mhm.
and how that civic ritual uh, brings together Canadians. So again, Okeophilia tells us that people are rooted in history and they have their own culture for which they should be proud. And I think people who are so rooted in their history and confident in their culture are far more welcoming to the stranger. But if we treat our own Canadian traditions as embarrassing relics, then integration for the newcomer becomes impossible
Mhm.
for the simple reason that there's no common ground to invite newcomers into. So I think what we need, first and foremost, is a civic culture that understands itself, that has a story to tell, a
Mhm.
language to preserve, a future to offer. Immigration then becomes an invitation into a shared moral and political project, and not just an administrative intake system.
I mean, that's very well said. I couldn't agree more. And finally, our last question here today. In your opinion, what steps could Canada take to regain control over its immigration policy and better serve the interests of its own citizens?
Right, thank you. I think it has to begin with the political will to restore open, honest, and courageous democratic debate. No one likes being called names because they have a view that's different from their prevailing idea. So Canadians must once again be meaningfully consulted and brought into the conversation about the future of their country. I don't think our politicians have been very good at that, quite honestly. I think the decisions made about immigration have been made. I don't know where they're made. I guess they're made in some committee in Ottawa. And immigration policy has to be responsive to public input. This means a conversation that's based on our national interests rather than ideology or GDP targets or the economy. So that's the first thing to do. And the second thing I think is We need to talk more about integration, about integrating our newcomers into the Canadian family. And there is a Canadian family, despite what our politicians might have us believe. And they need to be introduced into a understanding of Canada's political and cultural heritage.
Mhm.
And lastly, and arguably most importantly, our schools, and I think especially our universities, must do much more to cultivate a genuine civic consciousness among Canadians. Um, this involves, in my estimation, not just imparting facts about government structures or historical milestones, but fostering a genuine understanding of the responsibilities, the rights, and the shared cultural inheritance of what unites Canadians as a political community. So, a strong civic education, I guess, should instill gratitude for the institutions that sustain our freedoms and a sense of duty toward the common good. And I think, above all, and this is something that certainly was lacking in my own education, a strong appreciation for Canada's unique constitutional and democratic traditions. I think these are absolutely central to what makes this country function as well as it does. So, without this historical and cultural foundation, I think citizenship risks becoming merely this hollow abstraction, reduced to some kind of legal consumerist status, stripped of any kind of deeper loyalties, inherited traditions, or shared narratives that invest our lives with meaning. So, again, in my view, a nation is sustained not merely by legal frameworks alone, but by common memory, a sense of belonging, a sense of history, and the moral imagination of a people who see themselves as part of a larger story. Edmund Burke famously said that society is a contract between the living, the dead, and the yet to be born. And I think we in Canada would do well to take that advice to heart. But when the story is forgotten or ignored, the bonds of civic trust fray, and the very idea of a national community begins to erode. So I think what we need to do is hear from our politicians a robust defense of this country
Mhm.
and a robust defense of our constitutional traditions, a robust defense of our history, and those men and women who made this country one of the beacons of the planet. And finally, I think we need in some way to recover the sense that citizenship is a bond, it's a trust, and that a country is something more than just a zone of economic opportunity. It's a moral inheritance. I think any nation, Canada in particular, must be loved, it must be stewarded, and it's, when necessary, we need to defend our history and defend our nation.
I mean, well said, Patrick. Thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your thoughts. I think you had some very valuable insights. And if you want to explore this topic further, Patrick's article will be linked down below in the description. Again, Patrick, thank you so much for coming on here, and we will see you in our next show. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Natalia.
Thank you.